Raymond Ray Carter wasn't the kind of man people noticed. At 79, with a frame that had thinned but never stooped, and silver hair tucked beneath a sweat-stained cap, he moved through the world like a ghost always present, never acknowledged. His small house sat at the edge of Briar Ridge, a quiet southern town where time clung to the porch rails and creaked through floorboards. Most folks in town knew him simply as the old man who fixes bikes. Children brought him their rusted chains and bent wheels, and he never charged a cent. His garage, cluttered with tools older than most of the town's residents, smelled of oil, dust, and distant memories. The older kids whispered rumors. Some said he used to be a firefighter. Others claimed he'd been a pilot, but no one asked, and Ray never offered. He simply worked, nodding kindly, living each day with a quiet rhythm that had more to do with duty than routine. That morning began like any other. The rising sun spilled gold across his worn workbench as Ray loaded his Vana battered 1,985 Ford Econoline, rusted at the edges but running strong with parts he'd salvaged and rebuilt over the years. Inside were bundles of aluminum tubing, bolts, hinges, and a drill that had seen more surgeries on wheelchair ramps than any medical tool ever had. Ray was heading to the edge of town to build a ramp for Joe Baldwin, a Vietnam vet who just lost a leg to diabetes. Joe's wife had called Ray in tears, saying they couldn't afford the contractor's quote. Ray told her he'd be there by lunch and bring the materials himself. He didn't mention he'd pulled the money from the envelope marked property tax on his kitchen counter. Dressed in a flannel shirt patched at the elbows, faded jeans, and boots with cracked leather, Ray looked like someone time had left behind. A small American flag fluttered from the van's antenna. The license plate hung crooked, its characters worn from decades of sun and weather. He had a historical vehicle permit tucked inside the glove box, but he'd never been stopped before. He knew every road, every speed trap, every patrol schedule like the back of his hand. The van rattled as it drove, a metallic groan that echoed with each turn, but Ray trusted it. After all, he'd driven this same vehicle through floodwaters during Hurricane Katrina, hauling stranded families and wounded pets to high ground when the National Guard couldn't reach them. To the outside world, Ray was just another elderly man behind the wheel of a van, too old for the road. But to the people who matter at veterans without ramps, mothers with no groceries, children with broken bikes, Ray was everything. And yet, he never wanted recognition. He avoided Veterans Day ceremonies and politely declined every attempt to honor him at the VFW Hall. Service, he once told a young boy who asked about his past, doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs doing. He lived by that, quietly, purposefully. But that morning, as the van creaked past the town's last stoplight and turned onto Cedar Hollow Road, flashing blue and red lights flared in his rearview mirror. Ray pulled over calmly, hands steady on the wheel, and waited without panic. He didn't know it yet, but what was about to unfold would tear through the thin veil of his obscurity and remind an entire town, and eventually a nation, that the people we overlook often carry the weight of our freedoms on their shoulders. The cruiser doors slammed in unison. Two State Troopers Officer Chad Barnes and Officer Melissa Reyes stepped out with the swagger of youth and the quiet superiority that comes from believing you're the one in control. The mid-morning sun glinted off their mirrored sunglasses as they approached Ray's van. Barnes, the taller of the two and clearly the more dominant, tapped the front hood twice with the tip of his penlight. No front plate, no tag sticker. Driving a junkyard on wheels, he muttered. Reyes flipped open her notepad, unsure but following his lead. Ray kept both hands visible on the steering wheel, his knuckles weathered and scarred from decades of work. He didn't speak. He didn't look up. He just waited, calm as still water. Barnes leaned in first. License, registration, or just some good excuses, old man? The tone was mockery wrapped in protocol. Ray handed over both documents without a word. Reyes glanced at the worn-out VA card and narrowed her eyes. Raymond Carter, this address checks out, she said, scanning it. Barnes, unimpressed, peered into the back of the van. What's all this? Scrap metal? You selling this stuff? Or building yourself a time machine? He chuckled to himself, then motioned for Ray to step out. Out of the vehicle, sir. We need to have a better look. Ray obeyed, slowly, deliberately. His body moved with the caution of a man who knew exactly how quickly authority could turn. He'd seen it on foreign soiling regimes, where uniforms meant fear, not law. And though he stood on American pavement now, the feeling was uncomfortably familiar. As he stepped out, the van's door creaked open, revealing stacks of aluminum tubing, lumber, and power tools. Barnes scanned the interior. Looks like stolen construction supplies to me, he said. Mind explaining? For a ramp, Ray replied simply. For a vet who needs it. Barnes raised a brow, clearly not convinced. Sure, and I'm the Easter Bunny. He turned to Reyes. Let's call it in. Possible unregistered vehicle. Elderly male uncooperative. Maybe stolen property. Could be one of those off-the-grid types. Anti-government or something. Ray didn't flinch. He had learned long ago that silence was often safer than truth. Still, he knew this wasn't about the truck. It wasn't about the materials. It was about the way they saw him. Just another invisible old man with nothing valuable to offer and certainly nothing worthy of respect. They patted him down, hands brisk and impersonal, as though he were a threat. Reyes pulled a folded photo from Ray's shirt pocket. An old black and white image of a younger man in fatigues, standing beside a rescue helicopter, a dust storm swirling around him. What's this? She asked, holding it up. Ray looked at it briefly. That was me, a long time ago, Barnes smirked. Right. Next, you'll be telling us you saved the president. As they made Ray sit on the curb beside the van, a few cars passed. One teen leaned out the window and laughed. What did he do, steal some pudding? Another driver slowed to record with his phone, no doubt thinking it was another harmless encounter. But Ray sat stone still, his flannel shirt soaked slowly with sweat. His breathing remained steady. Even as the officers took turns peering into the van and trading jokes, he kept his composure. Decades ago, Ray had waited 72 hours under enemy fire in Laos for extraction. Compared to that, this was child's play. Still, it hurt. Not physically, but quietly, in the hollow space behind the ribs. The kind of ache that comes not from being insulted, but from being unseen. The concrete beneath Ray's legs was still damp from the morning dew, but he didn't shift his weight. Sitting on the curb, hands resting loosely on his knees, he looked like a man waiting for a bus calm, composed and completely out of place. But every inch of him was alert. He had once crouched like this in enemy territory, waiting for an extraction team that never came. He knew how to breathe shallow, how to disappear into the stillness. The problem was, these officers didn't see a man trained in survival. They saw a relic in a broken van, just another old guy making trouble. Officer Barnes nudged a length of metal tubing with his boot and snorted. Ramp parts, huh? I guess this is your big crime ring, Carter building steps for the disabled. Reyes flipped through Ray's small leather notebook, which she'd pulled from the glove compartment without asking. The pages were filled with names. First names, last names, some with stars beside them, some crossed out. This a code? She asked, holding it up. Looks suspicious. Ray glanced over. Names of men I served with. Some made it home, some didn't. She blinked but didn't respond. Instead, she tossed the notebook back toward his lap. It landed on the pavement with a slap. He picked it up slowly, brushing away a bit of gravel like it was sacred scripture. Reyes shifted awkwardly. Barnes showed no such discomfort. He leaned against the van, sipping his gas station coffee like this was a slow day worth killing. "Betty thinks he's Rambo," he muttered. People were starting to notice. A few cars slowed. One teenager on a bike stopped, pulled out his phone, and began filming. He zoomed in on Ray's unmoving figure and posted a caption within seconds. "Guess who's getting arrested in front of Pop's Hardware? Number boomer busted." From across the street, a woman in scrubs emerged from the pharmacy. Her name was Delia Walsh, and she recognized Ray immediately. Her father, a Gulf War veteran with Parkinson's, had a ramp built by Ray last winter. She crossed the road cautiously, holding her badge from the clinic in one hand. "Officers," she said politely, "I think you've got the wrong idea. That's Mr. Carter. He's a good man. He helps veterans in town, builds ramps, repairs bikes. Barnes cut her off. "Ma'am, please step back. We're conducting an investigation. For your safety and ours, return to your vehicle." "But he's not a criminal," she said, baffled. "He's a hero." "We'll decide that," Barnes snapped. Ray didn't defend himself. He didn't need to. But it didn't stop the ache. Not in his knees, now burning from the rough curb, but deeper in the chest, where dignity once lived untouched. It wasn't the rough hands, or the way they laughed, or the fact they hadn't read his documents. It was how little they cared to know, how quick they were to write him off. A van without a tag, a body past its prime, a man with nothing to offer. They wrote it up as uncooperative. Officer Reyes radioed dispatch, her voice taut. Possible vagrant, elderly male. Vehicle condition suggests abandonment risk. The words stung more than any wound Ray had suffered in the field. A block away, a man stood beneath the faded awning of the old gas station. Donald Brenner, a former Army medic, watched the scene unfold with narrowing eyes. He'd seen Ray at VFW meetings, never speaking much, but always staying late to sweep the hall or fix a busted railing. Donald pulled out his phone and made a call. His voice was low, urgent. "General Hall," he said, "it's Don. You're not going to believe this. They've got Ray Carter sitting on the curb like a stray dog." He hung up without waiting for permission. It started with the sound of tires, 3 of them, heavy and deliberate. Not the casual roll of traffic or the shriek of teenagers in souped-up cars, but the low growl of government-grade engines moving with purpose. The air changed. Even the birds seemed to quiet. From around the corner of Briar Ridge's sleepy Maple Street, a black SUV emerged, its polished exterior gleaming under the late morning sun. Then a second, then a third. Government plates, tinted windows. All 3 came to a synchronized halt along the curb, where Ray Carter sat motionless, framed by rust and blue uniforms. Barnes stood upright immediately, adjusting his belt like it might boost his authority. Reyes glanced nervously toward her partner, uncertainty flickering across her face. They hadn't called for backup, certainly not federal. Who were these people? The middle SUV's rear door opened with a whisper of hydraulics. Out stepped a tall woman in crisp Air Force dress blues, rows of ribbons glinting across her chest. Her face was carved with command sharp, focused, and utterly unamused. She didn't look around, didn't hesitate. She walked straight toward the officers and said, in a voice as cutting as ice, "Which of you detained this man?" Reyes instinctively stepped back. Barnes stammered, We were conducting a routine stop. Unregistered vehicle, suspicious cargo." The woman raised her hand, and silence fell like a hammer. "You just detained the man who carried my unconscious body through enemy fire in the Nangarhar Valley," she said, turning her eyes to Ray. "Sergeant Major Raymond Carter, Air Force Pararescue, Bronze Star, Distinguished Flying Cross. One of the few men I owe my life to." Ray blinked slowly, then nodded once, as if greeting an old student who'd finally made general. Behind her, a younger officer stepped forward, crisp uniform, leather portfolio in hand. The presidential seal shimmered on its cover. "Lieutenant General Maggie Hall," the man said, introducing her with reverence. "Commander, Air Force Special Tactics Wing." Gasps rippled from the crowd. The bystanders had doubled since the SUVs arrived. Phones were out, filming. The teenager who'd posted the mocking video now lowered his phone, shame washing over him as reality replaced ridicule. General Hall turned back to the officers. "Did you check his identification?" Reyes opened her mouth but found no words. Barnes forced a chuckle. Look, General, we were just doing our jobs, following protocol." "Protocol," Hall snapped, "requires judgment. This man wrote the rescue manual still used by pararescue teams in 3 branches of the military." She stepped forward and crouched beside Ray, who hadn't moved an inch. "Permission to help you up, Sergeant Major?" she asked. Ray looked her in the eyes for the first time and gave a small, approving nod. "Permission granted," he said quietly. She took his arm, but Ray stood mostly on his own. The entire crowd seemed to exhale at once. Children fell silent. Even traffic paused. There was something sacred in the way she steadied him, not as a formality, but as an honor. Then she turned to the officers, her tone now colder than before. "You don't get to apologize to me. You apologize to every man or woman you look past, because they don't fit your idea of importance. Today, you saw a rusted van and a tired face. What you missed was the man who helped pull 6 downed pilots out of a Cambodian jungle without backup." Reyes looked pale. Barnes looked stunned. General Hall straightened her uniform. "This is why respect comes first, not last. You never know who you're stopping." And just like that, the tide shifted. The silence that followed was thick, reverent, and full of weight. Even the wind seemed to pause as General Hall turned to face the growing crowd now spilling out from storefronts and nearby porches. She took a breath, her voice firm but clear, every word deliberate. "You all should know who Raymond Carter is, because men like him don't wear their medals, they carry them in their bones." She stepped aside, allowing her aide to open the leather portfolio. Inside were copies of commendations, photographs, and declassified portions of Ray's service record. As the aide displayed the documents to the officers and onlookers, Hall began to speak like a eulogy for a man still standing. "In 1972, Sergeant Carter fast-roped into a jungle ravine in Laos under enemy fire to extract 4 wounded soldiers from a downed Black Hawk. No air support, no second team. He carried the last man out with a gunshot wound in his side and a fractured rib in his own." A murmur spread across the crowd. A few people gasped. One elderly woman placed a hand over her heart. The teenage boy who'd mocked Ray earlier turned to his friend, face pale, phone forgotten. "In 1985, she continued, when an earthquake destroyed a covert U.S. base camp in Honduras, Carter led a 7-man recovery mission through unstable terrain. He personally recovered 14 survivors, 6 of whom would have died without his improvised field surgeries." Barnes looked away, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Reyes remained rooted in place, her notepad forgotten in her hand. General Hall's voice softened. "After 9/11s, when most men his age had long since retired, Carter returned to duty voluntarily to train special operations teams in emergency survival, night extractions, and wilderness medevac. Some of those techniques are still classified. Others are now taught to every Air Force pararescue trainee worldwide. She turned back to Ray. He trained me, taught me that a leader doesn't shout to be heard. He just acts, and people follow. Ray said nothing. His eyes remained forward, chin slightly raised. But there was a flicker of something behind them, a shadow of emotion rising through decades of silence. From the crowd, voices emerged, now familiar voices. He built my son's wheelchair ramp after the accident, a woman said tearfully. He showed up during the flood in 2008 with sandbags, never even told us his name, added an older man. He taught my granddaughter how to patch a tire and use a hammer, someone else said. He carried groceries to my mother's house every Tuesday for years, another voice added. Each voice chipped away at the myth of obscurity that had cloaked Ray Carter. He wasn't just a war hero. He was a neighbor, a quiet presence, a man whose legacy stretched beyond the battlefield into the lives of ordinary people who never knew they'd crossed paths with greatness. General Hall nodded toward the van. That vehicle, she said, was used by Carter during Hurricane Katrina to ferry wounded civilians and stranded families through 4 feet of floodwater. It was granted historical vehicle status by the Department of Defense, and it's still in our registry. Reyes looked down at her feet. Barnes cleared his throat and mumbled, "We didn't know." Hall turned toward them, eyes narrowing. "Number you didn't ask." Then, finally, she addressed Ray one last time. "Sir, you've served your country more times than we can count, but what you've done in peace, for this town and these people, may be the greatest service of all." Ray looked at her, and for the first time since the entire ordeal began, a thin, tired smile broke across his face. "Still got a few ramps left in me," he said. The crowd had swelled to nearly 60 people now, some with hands on their hearts, others wiping at their eyes, and all watching the quiet old man who had never once asked to be seen. Officer Barnes stood stiffly, lips pressed tight, the flush of embarrassment creeping up his neck. Officer Reyes, visibly shaken, removed her sunglasses and stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "I want to apologize. Truly. I had no idea." Ray's eyes rested on her. Not unkindly. He let the moment breathe. Then, his voice as low and even as it had always been, he said, "That's the point, ma'am. You never know who someone is just by looking at them. That's why respect comes first, not last." General Hall nodded slowly, as if that sentence carried the entire weight of her own career. She motioned for her aide, who produced a sealed envelope. Inside was a laminated summary of Ray Carter's service record, the unclassified version. She handed it to Barnes. "I suggest you both read this before your shift ends today, carefully." Barnes took the document, holding it like it might burn. Then Hall turned to the community. "What happened today isn't just a mistake. It's a reflection. A mirror we all need to stand in front of." She looked to Ray. "You didn't deserve this, Sergeant Major, but as always, you've turned even this into a lesson." Ray shrugged with a small, wry smile. "Old habits." As officers began removing the tape and dispersing the crowd, the mayor's car screeched to a halt beside the scene. Mayor Trudy Walsh, still in her gardening gloves, rushed from the vehicle. "Sergeant Carteri had no idea, please forgive us. This town owes you far more than an apology." Ray raised a hand gently. "I don't need a parade. I just need folks to look harder before they judge." "You'll get both," she replied, breathless. By that afternoon, City Council held an emergency vote. The 10th of June was declared Ray Carter Day, Flags were lowered to half-staff in his honor, not for mourning, but for reverence. Word spread fast. Videos of General Hall's confrontation flooded social media. Within hours, hashtags like number you never know who and number honor before assumption were trending nationwide. Veteran groups rallied. Civic leaders reposted. Local news anchors tried to summarize the gravity of what had unfolded. But no camera could capture the look on Ray's face when a child handed him a drawing of a ramp and said, "Thank you for building things that help people." 2 days later, Officer Reyes visited Ray's home. She brought coffee and a notepad. "I want to learn," she said simply. Ray poured her a cup, gestured to the bench beside his tools, and said, "Start by listening." And she did. Officer Barnes returned as well, though slower, humbled. He stayed silent for most of the visit, finally whispering, "I thought the badge meant I knew what I was doing." Ray didn't scold him. He just said, "A badge gives you authority. Listening gives you wisdom." The sheriff, after a private meeting with General Hall and town leaders, instituted a new community training program. Every new recruit would now be required to visit the VFW Hall, volunteer at the local senior center, and read the full case study of Ray Carter's stop. It was titled simply, "Judgment versus Justice, a Lesson from Briar Ridge." Ray never asked for that legacy, but it found him. And from that day on, when his van rumbled through town, no one laughed. No one called it a pile of junk. Patrol cars didn't follow it. They paused, pulled aside, and saluted. Because sometimes the man behind the wheel isn't just a retired mechanic. Sometimes he's the reason half the people saluting are still alive. Ray Carter didn't want a monument. He didn't want a statue, a plaque, or even his name etched into stone. What he wanted, what he'd always wanted, was for people to see each other, to slow down long enough to consider that worth doesn't wear a label. So when the donations began pouring in from every corner of the country, veterans groups, civic clubs, small-town mayors, even anonymous envelopes stuffed with $20 bills, Ray directed every cent into a single cause. It was called the Wings of Dignity Initiative, and its purpose was simple: build ramps, repair homes, and restore mobility for disabled veterans and seniors who couldn't afford the help. Within 1 week, the fund had reached $312,000. Ray took a sip of coffee at his kitchen table, glanced at the growing list of requests already coming in, and said aloud to no one, "Time to get to work." The first project was in nearby Dalesburg for a Korean War vet named Luis Ramos, who hadn't left his home in 3 months. The second was in Elmswood, where a double amputee from the Gulf War had been living on the first floor of a friend's house, too embarrassed to ask for a ramp. Ray drove his old van, still rusted, still rumbling, loaded with lumber, power tools, and a folded American flag he kept near the dash. By the end of the month, he'd built 6 ramps himself and supervised 15 more through volunteers. He never once sent a bill. But Ray wasn't working alone anymore. Officer Melissa Reyes had become his shadowat, first observing, then hammering, measuring, lifting. The department had given her the time off, but she hadn't asked for it. "This is more important," she told the sheriff. "This is real service." In her free time, she began speaking at town halls and youth groups, sharing Ray's story as a caution and a call to action. "We almost missed him," she'd say. "How many others are we missing right now?" Ray didn't comment on her speeches, but he handed her tools, offered quiet advice, and showed her how to use a level the right way. And when she got her first splinter and didn't flinch, he smiled. "You're learning." Meanwhile, Officer Barnes took a different path. He enrolled in trauma response training and began volunteering at the local VA hospital at first to make amends. Then, because he realized he'd found something meaningful there, the old men who used to glare at him now nodded when he entered. And eventually, one of the grizzled Marine in a wheelchair said, "You're not that punk from the Ray Carter thing, are you?" Barnes replied, "I was. I'm trying not to be." The Marine chuckled. "Good. Just don't screw it up." Even the sheriff changed. He rewrote the department's veteran engagement protocol. A new section was added to rookie orientation titled Recognition Before Reaction. And taped to the door of the briefing room was a laminated card, simple and sharp. "You never know who you're stopping." Ray continued to work. His name was passed from town to town like a secret worth sharing. The waiting list for ramp installations grew to 300 homes. So did the volunteers' young men with tool belts, retired tradesmen, even teenagers from the high school who once mocked him. Now they called him Mr. Carter, asked for advice, and posted pictures online not of an old man on the curbit of a legend holding a drill, smiling under the brim of a sweat-stained cap. And every week, without fail, his van rumbled down Main Street. Sometimes it carried lumber. Sometimes it carried groceries. And once, it carried a flag-draped coffin of a veteran with no family. Ray driving alone, escorting the fallen with dignity only someone like him could. He didn't need a spotlight, but he became one. The sun was setting over Briar Ridge when General Maggie Hall returned, this time without her SUV convoy, her dress blues, or a camera crew waiting to catch her words. She wore jeans, a soft sweater, and carried a bottle of Tennessee whiskey tucked under her arm. Ray was on the porch, as always, working a bit of sandpaper over a splintered handrail. He didn't stand. He just looked up and said, "Didn't expect to see you out of uniform, General." "I didn't come as a general," she replied. "I came as someone who still owes you a drink." Ray grinned and patted the porch chair beside him. "Then pour." They sat in comfortable silence, sipping under a sky streaked with pink and orange, fireflies beginning to blink across the yard. No speeches, no ceremonies, just two veterans who had seen the world change around them and kept on serving anyway. Maggie looked at him sideways. "You turned it around, Ray, like you always do." Ray shook his head. "Number, they turned it around. All they needed was a mirror." And he was right. The town of Briar Ridge had changed in the weeks after his encounter. It wasn't just the news coverage, or the social media shares. It was the way people looked now. Looked longer, looked deeper. The diner where Ray used to sit unnoticed now reserved him a table by the window. The high school invited him to speak once, then again, then monthly. Kids started calling him Coach Carter, even though he never taught gym. At the hardware store, people didn't just say hello, they offered to load his truck, asked about the next project, handed him tool donations with handwritten thank yous. But Ray stayed the same. Every morning, the old van rattled down Main Street, now with a new decal on the back that read, "Still serving." It carried wood, groceries, medical supplies sometimes, just Ray and his memories. And every time it passed the corner of Maple and Cedar, where he was once made to sit like a criminal, he nodded toward the bronze plaque embedded in the sidewalk. It read, "In honor of Sergeant Major Raymond Carter, because respect should always come first." But the most important legacy wasn't in stone or headlines, it was in people. Officer Melissa Reyes was now leading the department's veteran outreach program, training rookie officers to meet with veterans before they met them on the road. Officer Barnes, no longer cocky, spent his weekends building ramps under Ray's direction and rarely took credit for any of it. They both still called him Sir. And then there were the recruits' fresh faces in uniform, standing at attention in academy classrooms as instructors held up laminated cards with 6 words. You never know who you're stopping. Across the country, the Wings of Dignity initiative expanded to 5 states. Veterans who once lived in silence now had access to mobility, dignity, in the hands of strangers turned friends. Ray never asked to lead the movement. He just kept showing up with his tools and his stubborn, steady hands. The last line of Ray's service, record visible only in the unclassified version, read, "Repeatedly declined promotion to remain on the ground where he was needed most." That was Ray. He never needed a cape. He wore flannel and old boots and carried greatness in the way he never made you feel small. And when his time finally comes, and it will, there won't be parades or cannon fire. But you can bet that van will carry one last flag-draped coffin. And the town will stop, the officers will salute, and somewhere, another quiet veteran will watch from a porch, shoulders a little straighter, knowing they're not invisible anymore. Because one man showed the world that honor doesn't rust.